full of great. We're at 12:01, ready to go. We've got a big agenda full of fabulous commentary and perspective from some really talented professionals, quite an action-packed panel here today. So I think we're gonna get started as people are still rolling in. It's a little gray and dreary day here in New York, and people are taking an extra second or two to enjoy their coffee and get here. But thank you for everyone who's here on time for this. My name is Brian Tormey, and I am pleased and very excited to welcome everyone to another in the Be Your Best series with HGAR, getting the deal done. We are seeking second homes in New York, and we've got some fabulous panelists today that we're going to talk through this topic. First, I'm going to turn it over to Richard, the CEO of HGAR and president of One Key MLS, to do some further introductions.
So, Brian, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Be Your Best series, our webinar series to share best practices for getting real estate deals done in New York. I'm Richard Haggerty, CEO of the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors. We're a not-for-profit trade association representing more than 13,000 real estate professionals in Manhattan, the Bronx, Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, and Orange counties. As Brian said, I'm also president and chief strategic growth officer for One Key MLS, a comprehensive multiple listing service for the New York region. One Key has more than 45,000 subscribers and serves the region from Montauk to Manhattan to Monticello. Brian, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but we're hitting a milestone with getting the Deal Done webinar series today. We launched this series at the start of the pandemic in April of 2020. We're now 2 years in. A lot of facial hair has come and gone, Brian, during those 2 years.
Correct. There was, for a period there was a lot, and now it's all gone.
It's all gone.
I succumbed to Gary's lobbying.
It's always such a pleasure to host these panels, and there's such a level of talent and expertise on every panel that we host every month. Today, we're in the market for second homes. As workers return to the office and New York reopens again, buyers are continuing to eye second home locations closer to the city. Others are seeking weekend retreats or partnering to purchase in the Hudson Valley and on Long Island. We'll hone in on the hottest locales and how you can get deals done in the regional market. As always, we're very pleased to partner with TitleVest and have President Brian Tormey moderate our discussion. TitleVest is a leading New York City-based title insurance agency and a member of the First American family of companies, offering a full range of services for real estate property purchase and refinance transactions. TitleVest has offices in Manhattan and Westchester and engages in transactions upstate, downstate, and nationwide. TitleVest has won the New York Law Journal's Best Title Agency Award every year since 2013. That streak continues. Now let's meet our panel. We're very pleased to have with us today Catherine Jennings, branch manager of the Millbrook office of Houlihan Lawrence for the Hudson Valley. Also joining us is Robert Nelson, executive managing director of Brown Harris Stevens for the Hamptons. We also have with us Randy Flork, the founder and president of the Rural Connection, serving the Catskills and the Hudson Valley, and Jason Caritas, owner and principal broker of Corcoran Country Living, also serving the Catskills and the Hudson Valley region. Catherine, Robert, Randy, and Jason, we are so happy to have you join us today. And Brian, I'm going to turn it right back over to you.
Well, thank you, sir. Very much appreciate it, and always happy to be here. It is amazing that it's been 2 full years. What an adventure it's been. Therewith, I want to say thank you to you, Richard, Jeff, Gary, Kathleen, and the whole HGAR team, especially for this great adventure that's been, for putting this panel together and keeping it running. I think we've helped a lot of the constituency for staying connected and in the know in a way during a period where we really couldn't in the typical ways stay together. I'm excited to be at one of your events next week in person and sort of like gathering with some of the owners and brokerage owners again in person. But I think this webinar has been a great part of the pandemic and helping keep people connected when we couldn't be doing that. A few quick housekeeping items for everyone in the things. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. And a couple quick housekeeping items. We welcome everyone's questions. The Q&A function is where we ask you to place them principally. On most screens, it'll be down at the bottom amongst the icons, two little chat bubbles over each other. You can put comments and in the comment chat section as well, but we ask that the questions go into the Q&A function so we can queue them up and roll them into the stream of the conversation. We otherwise will keep everyone muted, but if you do need to sort of ask your question in a vocal way, mention that in your question and we can unmute you so you can ask the question verbally. With that, Richard, before we launch into our agenda for the day, this is that like moment every month we get your stats and metrics of sort of what's been happening. Tell us what we're seeing in the One Key dashboard.
Sure. I decided to focus just on really the counties where our panelists are focused. Obviously, it's tough to track the second home market per se, because what may be a second home for one person is a primary home for another. But just in looking at the markets that we're talking about today and looking at the pre-pandemic number versus what happened in 2020 and 2021. So we're comparing 2019 to 2021. Focusing on Dutchess County and looking just at single family homes, there was a 29.3% increase in the number of transactions during that 2-year period. There was an increase in the median sale price of 27.5%. So that's Dutchess County. Putnam, very similar, 31% increase in the number of transactions over that 2-year period, 23% increase in the median sale price. Sullivan County just knocked it out of the park. During that 2-year period, a 35.6% increase in the number of transactions and a 71.5% increase in the median sale price for Sullivan County. And Suffolk County, a 13.5% increase in number of transactions and a 27% increase in the median sale price. So needless to say, the last 2 years, 20 and 21, have been banner years for the entire market, but I think really the second home market is especially benefited from that 2-year period. And it's going to be interesting to see if our panelists think that trend is going to continue.
Richard, thank you for the stats. And those are some pretty impressive numbers for any market, but let alone covering several markets all around New York during such an interesting time. And obviously we've had a lot of real estate tailwinds. We may be coming into some headwinds as refi rates, or the interest rates percolate up. And we'll get to some of that here in a little bit. But one of the things that sparked our conversation, and here's where I'm going to start turning over to the panelists, was we're starting to, there's all these news articles and things talking about some of the different technology-enabled methods of vacation home ownership. And we were curious, sort of as a trade association, whether or not we're seeing that happen out here in the market, whether or not the Picassos and the sort of the orientation towards Airbnb and VRBOing is happening. And so I'm going to turn to our panelists first to sort of ask the question, are you seeing that in the market? Are you seeing buyers looking into these secondary markets and looking to leverage any new form of home ownership, like a split share where multiple people are buying a vacation home together? And if not, what are you seeing? What has been the pattern through the pandemic in terms of sort of the buying patterns? And we're going to soon turn to sort of what do we see in the future? So Robert, you had some interesting commentary specifically on sort of like the potential for some of these methodologies as it relates to really the oversight in the local municipalities. So I'm going to turn to you first.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we discussed this at our office meeting, and the Hamptons has always been a place where people have come for the summer, and in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was known sort of as a lot of group shares, younger group shares. They get a group, people together, and that didn't go over too well with the locals, so they enacted laws. One is no more than 4 unrelated people in a house. Mm-hmm. So that really affected the group shares, and then the other thing that happened was just the price point. It went so high, the summer rentals, that young people, even if they were going to share, they just couldn't afford it. So those two things combined sort of got rid of a lot of the massive number of people going into one house. Now we did have as Airbnb sort of took off, we did have a lot more Airbnb, even though in most jurisdictions, it is illegal to rent for less than 2 weeks. Some of them have only 2 rentals a summer. There's all different depending on the town. But the owners didn't care. They were just going to break the law and put it on Airbnb and rent it for a weekend. But they've been caught. The neighbors turn them in. There's a party and they get caught. But then since COVID, it's reverse. Now everyone's back to the brokers because they want to rent. They wanted to rent for the season, the summer, 6 months, a year. So it kind of reversed the last two years.
Yeah, and Catherine, you had some interesting commentary on sort of like town boards pushing back on Airbnbs, things. What are you seeing?
Well, it's kind of a divide. I think in Hudson and Rhinebeck, the Airbnb restrictions are gaining some merit because those are very restricted, smaller areas. Chatham, which is Northern Columbia County, sort of the top of the foodie side of the Hudson Valley market, tried the town board made a move to restrict Airbnbs, and the political whiplash was immediate and strong, and the entire board was thrown out. People had bought a lot of their properties intending to Airbnb them. There had been a renaissance of restaurants that the local population really couldn't support in Chatham. And that had supported, this is even pre-pandemic, this was pre-pandemic, had supported new restaurants, more employment. There were a number of economic effects throughout the town, and people overall from Main Street, primary homeowners, second homeowners did not want to see those kinds of restrictions in place that were going to potentially limit the number of people that could come to the area. 5 years ago, I think that 10 years ago, if we had shut down on Airbnb, the second home market might have even been stronger in sales initially, but now that's reversed. People that have Airbnb'd in our markets for years at the pandemic, they were like, we don't want to schlep our mud boots back and forth in our skis. We want everything to be in our own mudroom at our own house. And if we need to financially, we know we can Airbnb it. We know what the demand is. We know what we can do with the property if we're not able to fully utilize it. So in a way, Airbnb really flipped that. It became a reason for people to buy in our markets rather than a reason to avoid buying because they couldn't.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Jason, how about yourself?
Yeah, similarly, we've had such an influx of city-based buyers driven by the pandemic. And I think as things sort of stabilize or normalize and people are sort of spending more time back in the city, I think the overall concern with a lot of, let's say, longtime residents is that these houses will become like Airbnb, like revolving door of, bachelorette parties and so forth. And it's a genuine concern. Subsequently, as Catherine said, a lot of the municipalities here are reevaluating and changing their Airbnb laws. We've also seen quite a few 1031 exchange buyers buying properties as a group or as in a 1031 exchange because you can rent these out and get it 8, 9, sometimes a double-digit cap rate, which is a little harder to find in the city. But again, as I tell my agents and my agents tell their buyers, you need to look at the short-term rental laws as how they stand right now, because they are all changing. There are some municipalities that are capitalizing somewhat by charging for a permit, an annual permit, but even with a permit, it is restricted. So, and whatever you have today can be even more restricted, next month. So
yeah,
buyer beware.
And Randy, you and I have the pleasure of living in the same town as you. And there's been some hubbub here in our area. What are you seeing both here locally and more broadly in terms of sort of restrictions on use?
I actually I haven't felt that there's a huge pushback. There's been some grumbling, and some town rules and this and that. But I am it depends on which segment of my market you're talking about. I think when you're talking further north in like Sullivan County and things like that, Airbnb, I think, has become a big component of that and probably a large driver of why the prices are up 71%. And I happen to think, like, as a real estate broker, I find that like a large majority of my buyers start out as Airbnb renters. And so for me, I'm a big fan because they come for the weekend. They're like, oh my God, I love this area. Or they have access to using a home while they're looking for a house. And so I'm a big fan of it. And I can't say that I follow the rules super closely. I'm kind of a one-man operation. And so I don't follow things. But as far as what you mentioned about group people buying, I find that, like, for me, it's still typically, if that happens, if more than one party are buying a house, it's typically families. They're related and not strangers. And so I don't have a lot of like groups coming to me that are 3 or 4 investors and saying we want to buy properties to Airbnb. It just doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's been in the news, and I think in other states and markets it's happening, but it may not have made its way here for whichever reason, which I think was when we were envisioning this topic. I was, having read a lot of news, was sort of anticipating that we might hear that it had been happening, and it's a pleasure to sort of get corrected that, like, no, the market is saying we're not seeing it so much here. So
yeah, I think there's a good balance. Like, you know what I mean? There's like enough of it, but not too much. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, let's turn and talk about this new, like, right, where we've had this pandemic and we're now sort of in this finishing up, wrapping up, turning into this new kind of equilibrium, and trying to assess and understand and share with our audience here today and those who will be watching later what this new equilibrium will look like for people. Catherine, you had some interesting commentary on sort of like what kinds of homes and properties people were focused on pre-pandemic and then during the pandemic. Can you share some of those thoughts with us?
Yeah, I think that the psychology of the second home buyers has changed a little bit, and that they have a vision of what they want. This is pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. People have an idea of what it is that they want in a second home, and they're not really buying the bricks and mortar as much as they are buying the idea of a place of tranquility, a retreat. And what that vision is for them is very different for everybody that comes. Privacy is a relative term. Almost every single second home buyer will say, I want privacy. And, one person's privacy is one another's remote
isolation.
So getting to understand what each buyer, I think it's one of the reasons why buyers agents in the Hudson Valley are so critically important to really understand all of our various markets, because all of our little hamlets and towns each have their own little fingerprint. They're all very, very different. And what I like to remind my agents, it's like when your kid is looking for colleges and all the brochures look exactly the same, but they step foot on campus and they know immediately whether this is the place for them or not. And that's the way that people feel about our little villages and hamlets. They may have this vision. They've read about Rhinebeck. They think Rhinebeck is where I absolutely have to be. I love Rhinebeck. And then they come up and they find out that Rhinebeck isn't exactly, they're walking around and it's not really fitting well on their skin. What they were really looking for was more of Ancram, which is a very, very rural area. They want to be able to drive to Rhinebeck for sure, but they don't necessarily want to live there. And vice versa. Somebody else has an idea that they want 10 acres on a pond. And when they realize that to find that privacy, they have to go down a dirt road a mile. And they're imagining the horrors of mud season, which is a real thing up here. And they're like, no, I want to be walking distance to the downtown of Rhinebeck. So reading that buyer very quickly and being able to understand what their vision is, what they're telling you, because as you know, a lot of times buyers just have a sense of what they want and they have a hard time articulating it. So being able to look at those various things and figure it out. And from the pandemic point of view, I'd say that that distance from the city became, for the first time ever, became less of a factor. You could take a buyer that couldn't find what they wanted in Dutchess County and take them all the way an hour north to northern Columbia County. And if they found what their vision was in their budget, they bought it. And we are seeing a little bit of a couple of pandemic flips that we've seen are people that are now going back to work, or they re-enrolled their children in school in the city, and all of a sudden that extra hour is meaningful to them. So maybe we're a little bit headed back at this tail end to distance from the city being a priority.
Yeah. Robert, how about the Hamptons? Like, talk to us about out east and what you're seeing as sort of like the new equilibrium out there.
I felt that what happened is, I always think that the buyers always had a place they wanted to go anyway. We don't have a buyer that comes out here and says, oh, no, I'm going to go to the Jersey Shore, or I'm going to go upstate. They've already focused on their area that they are comfortable looking in. But I did feel, from what I heard from my agents, that the COVID thing moved that whole process up. So they might have said, oh, 1 day or 5-year plan or whatever their plan was. And all of a sudden it became an emergency. Like I know with all the people on the call, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, I have to have a place. I'm in the car now, you're coming out, I need a place tonight, and I need to live in it tomorrow. That kind of a feeling. But like I said, if they're buying in the Hamptons, they already had a connection somehow. Either that was what they always dreamt of, or they already knew people. But I was just looking at the stats. We only average between a low side of 1,700 units trading to maybe 2,100 a year, and last year was 2,600. So it's not like there were so many more homes that sold. But what did happen was those homes, we lost all the homes under $1 million, and the billionaires decided we had 10 homes between 43 million and 118 million. So the billionaires said, and that's what really drove our average, up to 2.8 million average home sale right now. And it was the high end.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're going to come back to that high end, that sort of state level, higher end here in a bit. But Jason, going back to you had an interesting comment, while Catherine mentioned she's had a couple that were that extra hour away that are turning into post-pandemic flips. Someone bought it, has done it for a couple of years, and now maybe that extra northern Columbia County has gotten to be a little bit too far. Talk to us about, I think you said and shared with us that you haven't had a single relisting of a pre-pandemic
right.
Pandemic
And
yeah, go for it.
after the run through, I actually went back and verified that because I wanted to be sure. And in fact, we have not had one flip. We've had people now, perhaps they bought it to use it or quarantined, hunkered down there, and now they do want to Airbnb it. But we haven't relisted one property that we've sold during that sort of the pandemic buying period. So I think that again, I think a lot of people lived here full time during that time from the city. They kept their place in the city. I've always said I think the talk of people leaving or an exodus from Manhattan, I think was completely overstated. I don't think and I still live in Manhattan. I've lived there for 30 years. And nobody in my social circle has actually up and left Manhattan. But a lot of them did sort of reevaluate the amount of time they need to spend there, even now in this new equilibrium. And they are, their work week may no longer look like, 9 a.m. on Friday until 6 or 9 a.m. Monday until 6 on Friday. And I think, you know, that's kind of what's driving. I think we are stabilizing somewhat, but I do think people have reevaluated how much time they need in the city, what they need in the city, and, you know, having a place to go for a few days a week.
Yeah.
And can I
that-
chime in?
Please, yeah.
So I'm going to turn tables on you. I'm making you a guest now. Because I mean,
Me?
let's talk about your experience, because you primarily lived in the city
Mhm.
for a good chunk of the week, and that whole dynamic changed for you. Can you tell us about your experience throughout
Sure.
that 2-year
Yeah.
period?
I lived in New York for about 27 years. I've been in real estate, started with Corcoran. I think I was with Corcoran when Barbara was still there yet, and moved around. I've always had a second home upstate. I was in the Hamptons. I was in Fire Island. I loved the beach, but I really wanted something a little more relaxing for me personally, a little more rural. I grew up on a farm, and I discovered the Hudson Valley in 2004, fell in love with it, and basically never left. It was a weekend house up until about 6 or 8 months before anybody heard the word COVID. Call it timing. I decided to purchase a local established firm in the Hudson Valley and make them Corcoran. And you know, obviously it timed out. I bought 2 firms and brought the Corcoran brand up here. And at that point, it was just kind of role reversal. This was my primary. I was here basically, I would go back to the city a couple weekends a month. And it's been a little bit of an adjustment, but you know, I like keeping a foot in both, but I've seen it change up here. And the whole reason for wanting to open a city-based firm in the Hudson Valley was because I've seen it changing here, you know, for years, long before COVID.
And Brian, you
so
had a
that's
similar experience, didn't you, Brian?
Yeah, I sort of moved up here, still have a place in Manhattan, but moved up here, but was commuting down 5 days a week, you know, back and forth, back and forth. And now the pandemic has sort of allowed these what I'm seeing with a lot of business owners and employees is sort of this new employee benefit. Like the tables have turned in the employee-employer negotiation, and working from home a couple days a week, I think, is a very common expectation amongst employees, no longer sort of just at the upper part of the career track, but even all the way down to nearly not quite entry level, but even at the very beginning part of careers, people in their 20s are sort of expecting, okay, I'm going to work from home 2 days a week. And that's allowing, I think, a lot of people to have, you know, if you're doing a commute to, you know, I lived for some time in Rhinebeck myself. I have a house there and worked in Manhattan from Rhinebeck on a daily commute. That was a long daily commute for the 1 year I did that. And then that became a weekend house. And I, you know, now live in Garrison, New York. And even that's a little bit long for 5 days a week. But at 2 or 3 days a week, it is a beautiful distance of a commute, right? It's a great break to be in and out of the city, but have time up here in the country and enjoy all the pleasantness. And I think there are a lot of employees that are finding that. And that's where I'm curious if that's what we're seeing. Randy, I might go to you. Like, what are you seeing with some of your clientele? Are they taking some of these homes they bought during the pandemic and continuing to keep them and sort of make, you know, as they are executives, you're doing higher end homes, they've got jobs and careers that are anchored in the city, but like, are they, you know, sort of extending and having a significant amount of time here in the Hudson Valley as they're going back to work full time?
You know, so I believe that the pandemic truncated what was happening anyway in the market. I think that people were already beginning to work from home 1 day a week or two. They were already starting that process. The COVID validated it and gave employers the runway to show that it works, and they worked out their model. So now it's a question of more like desirability than what is necessary. Like, it's not necessary to be in the office 5 days a week. And so what I'm finding is people. So I believe that the pandemic gave many people the excuse to do what they wanted to do, but didn't admit what they wanted to do. In other words, you had a lot of young couples, particularly with children, who didn't want to be that couple that were like leaving the city because they didn't want to be not cool and move to the suburbs or upstate.
Mhm.
But the pandemic gave them the excuse to do it. And now as the pandemic is receding, thank God, people, if you listen closely, people are starting to say, well, crime is more in the city. And so they're kind of using that excuse.
Mhm.
And so I think that like people are re-gravitating, reorienting themselves, you know, because a lot of people with kids, they're not going to rip their kids now out of school in Rhinebeck or Garrison or Cold Spring to go back to the city. And so I think some of them are keeping their city places, but most have like reoriented themselves. The city is still important to their lives, but they're not focused there. And just to comment a little bit on what Catherine said, you know, the old expression in real estate, buyers are liars. You know, they never buy what they say they're going to buy. And I think that has just accelerated, like with gasoline, as the availability of properties has gotten narrower and narrower. You know, everyone's like, I want a pool, I want this, whatever. And it's like, oh, it doesn't have a pool, I'll put one in. And so there's just a lot more flexibility in the market. That's the same thing with distance. They want it to be a certain distance. Now, the thing about distance will catch up with you if you do have to start going back into the office. If you don't, even on 2 and 3 days a week, being 2.5 hours away is difficult. But like in the hub of like our market, Garrison, Cold Spring, and that, you know, it's an hour and it still works. But you know, I think a lot of this, they've just reoriented their lifestyle around this decision, and I think most people are sticking to it.
Yeah. And you know, Jason, turning back to you as we're sort of looking at these properties people purchased during the pandemic up in these various markets up and east. You know, you had some interesting commentary on like how New Yorkers are thinking about their physical needs, their space needs. And this sort of phrase, you're just one more bedroom, please phrase. Can you talk a little bit about that and like your perspective on what country living represents for that?
I've always had this theory as a longtime Manhattanite that all we ever really want in New York City is just one more bedroom. You know, you land here, you're in a 4th floor walk-up studio. It's like, it's fine, it's great. And I just really want a bedroom. Then you get a bedroom, and then you you need a 2-bedroom for guests and so forth. And then, you know, all right, so I just want to get a 3 and then I'm done. And, you know, what I think a lot of New Yorkers have come to realize, or what they're reevaluating, is how much space they really need in the city. And they're realizing that the difference between a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom and a condo or co-op in Manhattan can often be the price of, you know, a lovely 3-bedroom Cape on 2 acres. And I think that's where that's why we've seen that part of the market really surge, is that people are just saying, okay, maybe we don't really need that extra bedroom. Maybe it just would be nice to have a place to go to, a couple days a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's turn to, we sort of put a pin for a second in sort of what we're going to call estate level properties here in these markets, things in the $2 or $3 million and up market, right? And that might be a different price point, you know, in the Hudson Valley versus the Hamptons. But sort of speaking about this, Catherine, you had some interesting points on sort of what you're seeing as trends in sort of like where people are going who are looking for a truly, you know, something that is more than just a little weekend place, but something more estate level.
Right. So I think that's the biggest change in our market, or the biggest swing of the pendulum with the pandemic. Right before the pandemic, we were really beginning to worry that some of these big estates that had been developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s that had extensive outbuildings, barns, tennis courts, pools, guest houses, caretakers' quarters. The buyers were saying, you know, we don't want all that. We are a 2-income working couple. We don't have time. There isn't, a stay-at-home mom who can act as the estate manager. These properties require too much. We want minimalism for our second home, and we want it to be turnkey, lock and leave it. All of those were real the trends that we saw in the second home market before the pandemic. And in 6 months, that flipped on its ear. It was just so fast that people wanted guest quarters. They wanted everything right there. They didn't want to go to a club, to a park, to anywhere else. They hike on their own property. They wanted to swim, play tennis. They wanted their family to be able to live there. All of a sudden, properties that had too much infrastructure before the pandemic were exactly what everybody was looking for. And just the way that Robert said that people were driving out of the city and saying, you know, I need it tomorrow. We had a family drive up, 4 kids and 2 dogs, and they said we've been living with relatives in North Carolina, and we're getting in the car and we're not going to stop until we hit Columbia County, and we'll buy something by the end of the weekend. And all they wanted was enough property for everybody to be able to homeschool or work from home and run around. And they bought a property that had been a little bit languishing on the market because it had so much infrastructure, but for them it was perfect. And that happened again and again and again. That was probably at the very beginning when the lockdown let up and they felt it was safe to drive through the terrors of the pandemic up to the north. But so I wonder how that will go as we return to normal. I think that if we continue to have as much work from home as we're continuing to have, if this becomes a permanent shift in the corporate market, I think that those bigger places with all the infrastructure will probably continue to be in demand. But if the companies really push back, because the problem with properties with a lot of infrastructure was the management and the maintenance, and you can hire the best caretaker in the world, and you still have a lot of decisions to make about, and there's a lot of maintenance in them. So if you're really using them, those properties are going to continue to be valued. So if everybody is there 2 to 4 days every single week, and you're Airbnb-ing it another time, those properties will probably continue to be in demand.
Yeah. And, Robert, I'm curious, what are you seeing at sort of that? You mentioned a couple, pretty stellar sales out in the Hamptons, estate level stuff. What are we seeing out there in the Hamptons? Is the desire today as strong as it is, a year and a half ago in sort of early pandemic? Are you still seeing a strong drive for very high end estate, or has it softened?
No, the billionaires still are. We listed one last week, land value only, land value, not on the ocean, at 22 million, and we had multiple offers at the end of the day, and it was land value. They were going to tear down the 60s ranch house, but there were multiple people that wanted that, and no, just we continue to have these incredibly high sales, but that's not your, those are hedge fund guys. That's not your average buyer. Your average buyer out here, which is interesting, is generally they're looking for only 1 acre and they want new construction. And there's not a lot of new construction because all the land's been built on, because we preserve most of it to farmland. So that's why it's still natural out here. But they don't want to fix, or they don't want to paint. They don't want to, they don't want to do anything. And but your average new construction, I just sort of say it's around 7 million on an acre, and I'll have a seller that will say, maybe he has his home that's 20 years old and it's on 5 acres, and he thinks that's the most wonderful thing ever. It's 5 acres, and it's top of the line. It is top of the line, but the kitchen and the bathrooms are, maybe green marble. They're not what the buyer wants today, and they also don't want 5 acres. They just look at this as like, I have no interest in, 1 acre is plenty. And so and that has not changed through the pandemic. That was already happening, for the last 10 years. The larger properties were not as desirable, except for when we get into crazy prices. Then the estate is, it does happen to be 8 acres or whatever, but they can afford it.
Yeah. How about you, Randy? What are you seeing in more of the Mid-Hudson Valley?
It's a different market, so it's kind of polar opposite as far as like land usage. People want more acreage, not less. It's just a different mindset. So I understand the difference in the buyers. I think the high end stuff is doing well here. What happened with the pandemic is we went through all the underbrush. We got rid of anything that was on the market that lingered. So there's nothing. So what's on the market now is actually quite good and pricey. And I think that the jump in prices in the upper stuff is actually getting higher, not lower. I think we're maybe a little bit behind. There's like a reverberation, it's just taking a while. Some of these people who've bought houses in the 2 range that have done work to it, it's now worth double that. And so the problem is just, the market. The problem is the inventory. It's hard to draw any conclusions when there's so little on the market. It's like, it feels like it's more one-offs than it is,
right.
Like I think our numbers would be as good or better than during the pandemic right now if we had the inventory, but we don't. And that would calculate for like price increases and things like that. But, you work with what you got, not with, what you want.
Right. Agreed. Turning for a second to sort of like who's buying, and, especially at this higher end of the market, Jason, you had some interesting examples of non-New Yorkers, people who aren't New Yorkers buying in the New York vacation markets, and sort of like what trend might be sort of showing up there. And Catherine, you had some too. So Jason, we'll start with you.
We've seen a kind of a trend of basically 2, and again, luxury obviously is relative, right? Luxury in the Hudson Valley is obviously very different than luxury in the Hamptons, but in the higher, I'd say over 2 or 3 million, or even over 5 million. We've seen an uptick from West Coast interest. And I think I cited, we had listed the Aston Martin estate, their first single family designed estate, which was still on spec. They're working on it now, but we had 3 offers and it was over $8 million. We had 3 with the list price, 3 offers competing for it. It did go, it did go to contract and actually it's closed on the land. But interestingly, all 3 of the parties were from the West Coast, which I found interesting. Part of it is because it's an extremely modern, the modern architecture aspect of it. And, as I said, you want a fabulous, 1840s colonial, we could find that for you. It's a little more challenging to find good modern architecture in the Hudson Valley at this time. I do think some will be built. But it was interesting. We had, inquiries from the Hamptons as well for that, where I think people bought there, realized they did incredibly well with their investment, can buy something in the Hudson Valley and still stock a couple $1 million in the bank. But we have seen an uptick in that sector of the market, and in the luxury market, we've seen an uptick from the West Coast.
Yeah. And Catherine, how about you? You had some similar commentary.
We've had, what I would call environmental refugees from California that they want to be in a different environment, free from forest fires. And, the high taxes in New York are relative when you're coming from California. It's not so daunting. As Jason said, the exodus from the Hamptons was kind of notable too. We had quite a few people. I think that when the Hamptons, some of the people that first went out to the North Fork or out towards Montauk and East Hampton in the 80s and 90s, as it began really getting built up there, I've heard more than once that coming to the Hudson Valley feels a little bit like when they went out to the Hamptons. We'll never have the beach, obviously, but it feels more of a, calm, sort of less frenetic lifestyle. I don't think that anybody that really wants to be in the Hamptons today really wants to be in the Hudson Valley. They draw 2 very, very different kinds of buyers. They're not, but I do think that some of the buyers from 30 years ago on the Hamptons have their profits and moved up to the Hudson Valley. Another thing that Jason was talking about is if we had more modern architecture, our prices would be rapidly increasing that much more. That's really where our unmet demand is highest. Nobody does want to do work, as Robert was saying. And, but moreover, that look of the modern home is something that so many buyers are pursuing at any cost. And the subdivisions, because up in our northern markets, we all have town plans in place, and every single one of those town plans prioritizes first retaining the rural nature of the property. So even if you have a large farm, getting a subdivision of over 4 lots approved is a Herculean effort. It'll take you a long time. And most of our larger landowners that decide they want to subdivide to build are going to in that 4 lot subdivision simply because it's easier and there's so much demand for people. If you have 100 acres, I would argue that you have greater value in 4 25-acre lots than you would have in 25-acre lots. So that puts the constraint on pricing as well, because you don't have the economy of scale to build. If you are doing 4 lots, each one of them is incredibly customized. It'll take a long time. Most of our top builders right now are telling 3 years out is the minimum for construction, so that when buyers hear that, it even more accelerates the value in their mind of the property that they can buy today that is modern in nature. So, and we're seeing some interesting renovations, log cabins, which were the dearth of our, nobody wanted a log cabin. And all of a sudden, some designers are coming out. I think the New York Times had a story about one of our agents, Anthony. He has D'Argenzio has a design firm, and he and his family bought a log cabin and made it into this really incredibly modern looking house. And so people are going to get creative. They're going to be more inventive about how to find and take what's already there, because it's so difficult from planning stage through construction to get everything that they want.
Well, and that starts to speak to one of the next questions that we wanted to talk about is, will supply ever catch up with this demand in the future, right? Like, we know that supply, as Randy, you just said, the supply isn't there for the demand. There's a mismatch, a gap. We're constrained in our inventory. And Catherine, you started talking about a little bit of this, like, here's some of the reasons why maybe supply won't catch up with demand. And I'm curious, turning to, Jason, I may come back to you, like, what are the things that you think, is supply going to catch up with demand, or is there anything that you think is going to sort of change that equation or keep supply from catching up to demand?
I think, everything is secular, as we know, in real estate. And I think eventually there will be a better sense of balance in the market between buyers and sellers right now. I do think the one thing that will change is you will see more development of more modern architecture. It is something particularly city-based buyers, that they want a place in the country, they want the serenity, but they want it to look like their loft in Tribeca. And that's hard to find. We are currently working on a project of about 16 to 18 homes in Milan that will be modern. I could say it's renowned architect Jorge Figueroa is a Latin American modern architect. They will all be bespoke, and just a few people that we've been able to share, even in the city at Corcoran, is that we're already getting, is our waiting list. I do think you're going to see, I think we're going to see more development of modern homes, as well as more single family detached. I think we're going to see, that increase was even higher than single family attached, pardon me, more condominium product. And that increase was even higher than single family, homes. I think we're seeing more people that empty nesters that want to be up here, want proximity to the city, but don't really want to deal with lawn care and shoveling and plowing, you know? So I think it's shifting. I think the increased interest from a lot of different demographics is exciting. I think it'll keep the market here robust for a while. But yeah, I mean, I think at some point we will find a balance.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that I'm taking away from some of the earlier commentary for our audience here is there are a lot of nuances. And Catherine, I'm going to sort of call on some of your phrasing of, people and Randy, your phrase, buyers are liars. They think they want this and they think they want to be in this town. And I want to be in Rhinebeck because I've read all about it and everything. And now maybe you come meet them and you assess and you're like, I don't think that's what you want. What you really want is this. As we're like talking with a lot of agents here and attendees who are both, New York City based agents, as well as, in other markets, any commentary on sort of like what it's like working in some of these different areas and sort of working with buyers and advice for them as to how to go about if they've got someone looking to do a transaction or looking to move to that market. Any thoughts and guidance? Catherine, I may start with you and then we'll go to Robert and come back around the horn.
Yes, I think talking to we're talking about referrals, since we do have Manhattan brokers on the line here. I think that making a personal phone call, I think in a second home market, trying to match your buyer with the right agent becomes critical for a successful sale. Someone who truly understands what that buyer is like and what they're looking for, because it's really going to be a relationship in this market. Before the pandemic, there was an average of 3 years of looking before somebody would buy. That wasn't because of the lack of inventory. That was because the buyers had to sort through all of the variables that they were unprepared to sort through in a second home purchase. They came with the idea of what they wanted. They had a budget. They found out maybe their budget didn't match the location that they thought they wanted. Then they would reevaluate. They'd have another child. They'd reevaluate again. They'd other priorities would come in. Finally, after about 3 years, they were ready to buy. That obviously is not the case right now. They're ready to buy. They're coming pre-approved. They're coming with their letter of available funds, but there just aren't the houses out there, right? And I think that where we are meeting demand is by the expansion into markets that will begin to become very trendy in the next 10 years. Athens is a very good example on the west river. It's a very depressed little village, and Athens is getting very hot. It's across the river from Hudson. Incredible values there that you can still get from outside. So I think that the buyers are pushing into markets that they wouldn't have previously considered in order to be able to find what they want. And finding an agent who either works with other agents. It's great to have a big team. Our office covers from Litchfield County, Connecticut, over to Ulster County, down to Orange County, up to Columbia, Greene counties, even into Rensselaer, and over into the Berkshires. So not every agent obviously will drive that far. That's, 2 hour north, south, and east to west. But we've got a great team of agents that work together. And I see this all the time on our weekly meetings where somebody will say, hey, I've got exactly what that buyer is looking for, but it's way up here in Rensselaer. And the agent that's working with the buyer will say, you know what, I'll refer them to you, we'll split them. If you'll show them, I think that they're ready to move further north, right? So I think that that's where we're going to meet the inventory needs, but making sure that you're with the agent that you refer to really gets your buyer and match them up well. And as managers, I'm sure, Jason and I, are happy to help that agent find the right buyer, connect with them and say, the right buyer's agent. And say, this sounds like a good person. Go and talk to them. That might be the right agent to refer to, because it's a very, very personal decision. It's not based on zip code and school district and square footage. It's a multi-dimensional decision, and you want to have the right agent that can really communicate well with your type of a buyer.
Yeah. Robert, any thoughts on that?
Well, my favorite story always, I've been a broker 38 years, and my favorite story always is when they get in the car and they have their legal pad with them, and they start every property. They start writing down all these notes, every single little pro and con, every little this. They attach the listing sheet to it, and I always chuckle, because it's like, no, there's going to be one. I know it's going to happen already. You're not going to go home and go like, oh, which of the 10 do I want? No, it's. But that's the process they go through, and in the end, when I was quoting some of those prices, I don't want to just imply that you have to have $7 million to come out here. There's condos and co-ops in West Hampton Beach on the sand that start at $550 to $1 million. One bedrooms facing the ocean. So there's all different price points. It's just that the majority of these buyers don't want to do a lot of work. But we've cleaned out all of our homes that needed work. They're kind of gone now. But back to a previous comment, this is cyclical, and we'll have a time we'll be on this call saying like, where are the buyers?
Right. Very much. Well, as we're starting to round out, Randy, I'll turn to you. Any comments on sort of, this sort of question of what do we think the new patterns as we look forward in these sort of, these markets surrounding New York City? Any guidance and advice to those and here in attendance on what you think the future holds and how to best transact and be their best in the going forward days?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't. And, I've had moments in my career, I can remember in 2008, that I could have had the best properties in the country and still couldn't sell anything so a lot of it is out of our control. We pretend that we are so critically important, and we are, but we also have to remember that market trends, if interest rates go to 20%, we're not going to be selling a lot of houses. So some things are just out of our control, and no matter how talented we are, it doesn't matter. And so predicting things is hard. I think that the supply chain issues and the contractors tied up with work, like the one for 3 years, whatever, does make people more inclined to spend more up front on a house than they were willing to previously. And I think, I've always maintained a fund where I bought houses and restored them and sold them. I'm not even doing that right now because of the fact that there are no foreclosures on the market. There used to be tons. And so that whole segment of the market is out, kind of, I think, is not happening. And I think that's a while before anything like that re-enters the market. And I will say, as far as buyers go, I have lost a lot of buyers as of recent who are just completely over losing multiple properties in bidding wars. Good buyers under normal circumstances who would be able to get a place, and they've just lost 2 or 3 in a row, and they're like, forget it. We're just going to lay back and whatever. So I think things like that will help the market ease up a little bit and become more of an equilibrium that we can all, because I do think it's a better process when things are not so hot. I just think it's better for everybody. People are less regretful when they bought a property and they paid over asking, and then down the road they're just like, they have like second thoughts or remorse. That doesn't happen as much in a normal market. And so I think, again, there will be less of a flip market going on, because it's just not the properties available. There's not the workers available. There's not the supplies available to make that. Because the thing about a flip, you got to do it fast. And if you can't get a dishwasher, you can't get a refrigerator, like you can't do it fast, let alone to mention a contractor. So I think like the done properties that people have are going to continue to do really well. And there's not going to be a lot else on the market.
Yeah. Well, to round us out, Jason, any final commentary and thoughts and guidance? We're at time, but any closing words?
Okay, briefly, I think the this goes out to not only my colleagues in the city or agents in the city, but also to buyers. The timeline from which a property hits the market to when it is, in play has never been shorter historically, ever, certainly in the Hudson Valley. I don't think there has ever been more of a need to have a local expert, whether you're referring a buyer, whether you're a buyer yourself. You don't have the time. Zillow does not tell you about the municipality or when it's going to be assessed again or what's a buried oil tank. You have to have a local expert helping you not only find the property but through the process. And often we all the way down to who's going to do my lawn, who's a good tree service company, who do I get to do my pools. It's like it's just imperative to have local expert and work with them. And I say this also to agents in the city. I know they try to come up and do deals and then wonder why their clients miss out. And it's just the referrals go both ways, obviously, but get yourself a local.
I think that's a very perfect ending commentary, right? There's so much nuance in these markets and they're so localized. And thank you for being some of our local experts on this panel. We'll pop up the slide with your respective contact information so that our attendees and future attendees can have a chance to access and get a hold of you so that they can access that local expertise that you bring to the table. So thank you for sharing an hour of that with us today and all our attendees and future watchers of the session. Thank you, Richard, and the whole HGAR team for always keeping these sessions lively and fun. And best luck to everyone in finding this new equilibrium and navigating through all these things. But I'm excited to continue as the world opens back up to start to see all of you in person again soon. Well, thank you, everybody. Take care. Be your best.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Brian.